In 1996, Leeds United joined the growing number of football PLCs which were hoping to pull off that difficult balancing act, rewarding their investors while keeping fans happy with success on the pitch. In recent years, we've seen the failure of the PLC business model all over football, but nowhere did it unravel faster and more spectacularly than here at Leeds United. In 1997, Peter Ridsdale was installed as chief executive with a brief to bring back the glory days.
Ridsdale was an unknown quantity in the city. He'd really made his name principally in the area of human resource management, and so his background was personnel, and he really became a name in the city on the back of Leeds United, which gave him profile.
Ridsdale had an ambitious plan to please fans and shareholders. He bet on the side performing well in the Premier League, because the higher they finished, the more money they would get from TV. He called it his business model. But was it good business sense?
That model was built on aspirations to be in Europe most years and to assume you towards the higher end of the Premier League so that you got the merit money at the end of the season and you got a high number of appearances on television, because that's where the money came from.
The arrival of Rio Ferdinand in November 2000 for a British transfer record of £18 million was a symbol of Ridsdale's early success. More memorable still was Leeds reaching a semi-final place in the European Champions League against Valencia. At the time, Ridsdale was the league's highest paid executive, on about £600,000 a year, and he wasn't afraid to play up his image as football's big spender.
I believe that in the next couple of years, people will reflect on this day as acknowledgement that Leeds United have arrived.
In 2001, Leeds' budget was based on finishing in the Premiership's top four and qualifying for the Champions League. It went to the last game of the season, but on May the 19th, heartbreakingly, Leeds missed out. The jackpot had slipped away. By now, the club's debts were £39 million and the stakes were rising ever higher.
They reacted like a gambler who was on a losing streak in the Las Vegas casino. They went out and they gambled more.
The Leeds board approached the bank and took out a loan of £60 million, secured against future gate receipts. A large chunk of it was blown immediately on new players. One of the first cheques to be written was for £11 million to buy Robbie Fowler.
You know how many people there are here today. It would have been nice to charge you all for the privilege.
But the trouble is, footballers aren't like normal business assets. Their value can collapse suddenly, either through injury or poor form, but their wages must still be paid. Ridsdale was effectively betting the ranch on his team gaining a Champions League slot. I wanted to find out what the players felt at the time about that Ridsdale spending spree, so I arranged to see Danny Mills, Leeds' former fullback. We got together for a game of golf.
Oh. That's the one. That's more like it. It signed Robbie Fowler about a month beforehand. You know, we had an absolute abundance of talent. Yeah. And it looked like no way in the world that we were going to finish outside the top two. We didn't necessarily presume, but we expected to get in the Champions League.
But the gamble didn't work. Despite spending about £90 million on players in just 3 years, in April 2002, Leeds again failed to reach the Champions League. By June of that year, the club's debts had soared to £78 million, and its stock market value was down to just £20 million. As a business, Leeds was starting to fall apart. Ridsdale's response was to dump the manager who'd egged him on to acquire all that expensive talent. David O'Leary had been in the job 3.5 years. He'd been given a blank cheque and won nothing.
I went in this morning thinking, you know, I'm going on holiday tomorrow. So to organise every bits and pieces, and the chairman says, you got the sack.
Sacking O'Leary cost the club £3 million in compensation. Another kick in the kitty. What did the supporters make of all this? After all, weren't they baying for costly transfers to boost the team?
Fans never scream for clubs to spend money. They never scream, you know, sometimes they say we're a bit lacking left back or right back, we're a bit lacking in midfield. But we don't, you know, we're not knocking at the door of the chairman saying, I think it's about time you spent £80 million because, you know, we want to get into the Champions League.
I think some of the buys that we had were maybe a little bit excessive. If we look back, you know, with hindsight, it's easy to say. You know, we had, I think at one point we had six great strikers. Probably a little bit more than we needed.
You can say that again. Debts were piling up as Leeds' total wage bill hit more than 50 million a year. Even Ridsdale admitted it was an own goal.
Did we make mistakes? Yes, of course we did. Did we probably invest too much? I think time would suggest that we invested too much as well. I think the squad became too big, partly because of a lot of injuries. And then, well, you know, it's sometimes difficult to persuade a manager that he needs to reduce the squad size.
Terry Venables was the man Ridsdale appointed to put Leeds back on track. Not known for his financial acumen, Venables certainly had the look of a man who was happy with his terms and conditions.
You know what I mean?
But what Venables hadn't worked out, or hadn't been told, was that he was walking into a fire sale. Leeds' debts were racing towards 80 million. The club was in a hole and still digging. Cash had to be found from somewhere.
2 years without Champions League football was the death knell, and it meant serious restructuring. It meant having to effectively downsize the squad, their major asset that they'd invested in, to reduce the wage costs and to try and recover some of the capital that had been invested in the playing squad.
In order to service the debt, players were offloaded. First to go was Ferdinand, sold to Man United for a new transfer record of 30 million. 12 million more than Leeds had paid for him. A rare piece of good business.
We have to accept that buying and selling players is part and parcel. If you invest in a big playing squad and you have to recoup some cash, people shouldn't be pointing the finger if indeed you not only recoup the cash but do a good job in the transfer market.
But apart from Ferdinand, Leeds' transfer dealings were disastrous.
In any business, when you try to offload assets when you have to in a fire sale, you don't get the market value. And Leeds found that to their cost. They found that clubs were taking full market advantage of the dire straits that Leeds were in. They got nowhere near the prices that they had paid for these players at the top of the market.
Next to go was Robbie Keane for 7 million, a loss of 4 million. Then Robbie Fowler went to Manchester City at a loss of 5 million. So desperate were Leeds to sell him that they even agreed to pay part of his wages at his new club, a deal that still cost Leeds over £500,000 a year. Later, Lee Bowyer went for just 300,000. Liverpool had offered 8 million only 6 months earlier. The final straw came with the sale of Jonathan Woodgate in January this year for 9 million. For Ridsdale, this was painful. It was the perfect illustration of his conflict between being a businessman and a fan.
As a fan, I would not have sold Jonathan Woodgate. As chairman of a public company, I have a duty to shareholders and to supporters to make sure we've, as I said already, got long-term financial stability.
The proceeds from Woodgate's sale brought temporary relief for the shareholders who'd seen losses spiral. But for Leeds fans, it was grim as the squad was further diminished.
When Jonathan Woodgate went, the argument of the board was it was a good business decision. Our argument was it's a bad business decision and a bad football decision, because the bottom line is if you're not successful on the pitch, you're not going to have any money in the bank.
You don't have a business.
You don't have a business. That's it. It ends.
More shocking for Bermude's supporters was the revelation that many Leeds players had been financed by Ridsdale through a leasing deal. In short, the club didn't own its most valuable assets. Without Woodgate, Leeds' performance on the pitch went from bad to worse. With panic wafting through Elland Road, the board again pushed the eject button. They sacked Venables, costing the club another 2 million in compensation. For Leeds, it really was a dark, cold winter. So does Ridsdale have any regrets?
It does appear to me that people are very happy for you to buy and very loath for you to sell. And I think we have just to get that balance right. And I do not accept that selling of itself means you can't compete. It depends on what squad you've got left, how good they are and how well managed they are.
The fans blame Ridsdale, not the managers. Stripped of support on the terraces and in the city, he resigned in April.
Should we have spent so heavily in the past? Probably not. But we lived the dream.
Ridsdale had tried to make Leeds the new Man United. but he left the company with a stock market value of just £10 million, debts of £80 million, and a team dangerously close to the drop.
You put trust in people at board level. You know, you have a financial director, you have a managing director, you have a chairman, you have people that are supposed to know how to run a company. Peter Ridsdale was the highest paid executive in British football at one point. Yep. These people surely are paid to do a job. You know, I don't expect somebody that's serving in, you know, in Burger King to run a PLC, but somebody who's paying themselves 300, 400, 600,000 pounds a year should know how to run, which is basically a medium-sized PLC.
I think ultimately it was a triumph of vanity over sanity, that Peter got carried away with the emotion of it and the whole future of the club. And I mean that quite honestly. The whole future of the club has been put in risk, has been put in jeopardy in order to fuel a dash for glory.
Ridsdale may have lived the dream, but successor Professor John Mackenzie walked into a nightmare. Last month, the club announced the worst financial results in the history of British football. Mackenzie soon discovered that cash wasn't pouring out just on players. The club had 70 cars on lease, was hiring private jets, and even renting an aquarium for Ridsdale's office. Behind the scenes, was there a culture of extravagance at Leeds? Was that part of the problem?
I think it was I would probably use the word indulgence. I think that maybe if you're running a huge business, you can adjust to certain things that you can't adjust when you're a smaller business. And I don't think the company adjusted to those situations as quickly as it should, and so it exacerbated the problem.
With the benefit of hindsight, what would Ridsdale have done differently?
I don't think there's a single thing I could change. Looking back, I know we were probably overambitious. We overstretched. We went that transfer too far. That of itself causes problems.
Problems? What Leeds are now facing is meltdown. This week they sacked their third manager in just over a year and are desperately renegotiating their debts.